Hi, I'm Kayla. For this active learning assignment, I went ahead and listened to the podcast by Brian Waters and Ryan Ballard titled Filled with Gold, A Widow's Story by Melissa Pierce. Brian was the one who conducted the interview with Melissa. Melissa is the interviewee in this case. This quick summary of what she was interviewed about was a tragic life event that happened to her when she was in her mid 40s. So I'm going to briefly go over that, but essentially the interview is about her grieving process and how she got through the process by finding resources that helped her, and how she was going to use that information to help widows moving forward who also need those great resources. So to a little bit of her story, she was 44 at the time. She married a man named, well, they were married prior, but she was married to a man named Dave who was 46. They had adopted 2 children, living in Oregon together. She called their life idyllic. They were living a wonderful life. Dave had a great job in instructing music at a school, grades K through 12. They lived in a great little community. Kids were happy and involved, all of this fun stuff. She was working for a Fortune 500 company. One night, her and Dave go out for dinner, come home. This is a Friday. They come home and Dave starts complaining about some chest pain, just some like weird congestion or pain in his chest area. They don't think a whole lot of it at the time. Melissa gives him some Mucinex, thinking maybe it's a sinus respiratory thing, whatever. He takes it and he goes off to bed to just kind of relax for the night. Melissa and her youngest son chill and watch a movie and fall asleep on the couch. Meanwhile, Dave and Melissa's eldest son is away at camp about 4 hours away from where they live in Portland. Melissa wakes up the following morning on the couch still and kind of thinks that it's weird that Dave's nowhere to be seen because he's an early riser. So she goes into the bedroom and she sees on the bed Dave's now gray colored legs sticking out of the blanket hanging off the side of the bed. This worries her, so she gets up closer for a closer look, and she realizes that Dave is not breathing. So she calls 911. They tell her to conduct CPR, which she does, but she quickly realizes that her husband, at only 46 years of age, the father of her children and the love of her life, has died overnight. She calls, like I said, she called 911, and an interesting part of this story that she was telling, her life story, is that it took EMTs an entire hour to get to her house because the night prior there was a snowstorm. So for an entire hour, she sat with her one son in the shell of a home at this point, while her dead husband lay just in the other room. She's freaking out. She doesn't know what to do. So she calls family. She has to share this horrifying, traumatic news with her son who's at camp 4 hours away over the telephone. So I can't imagine anyone having to do that, but she had to do that. She said that she remembers some parts of that day vividly, like SpongeBob SquarePants playing in the background on the TV. But in terms of people going in and out of the house, it's kind of all a blur to her because she was in physical and mental shock. So that same day, so that Saturday morning, the funeral home had come to collect her husband's body. At the time, she didn't know what funeral home to call, so she had gotten a hold of her brother-in-law, who was a minister and had worked with the 2 or 3 funeral homes they had in their town at the time, and he had recommended the one that he preferred. So that is the one they went with. Like I said, the funeral directors came, picked up the body, and took her husband away. The following day, the medical examiner calls Melissa and shares with her the cause of death. Now, there was no autopsy completed. The medical examiner didn't find a need to do that. The cause was officially determined undetermined, with some underlying maybe sleep apnea issues or respiratory illness. Melissa stated that Dave had had a physical the week prior and blood work came back normal. Everything came back normal. She said his only issue truly is that he would snore. He had sleep apnea. He would snore and, occasionally have moments that he would stop breathing in the middle of the night, but she would just, the typical wife nudge and everything would be fine. Another interesting part of her story is that she mentioned if she could go back, she wishes she would have really pushed for an autopsy to rule out every other possible cause of death for her husband, Dave. However, at the time, she knows her 2 sons were adopted, so if it was a health-related issue that caused Dave's death, she has nothing to worry about for her sons because they're adopted. They don't share the same hereditary or genetic. They wouldn't share those same issues. But I thought that was an interesting point, the kind of what if that was lingering with her years after the incident had occurred. So after she spoke to the medical examiner, her next contact with the funeral home was the following Monday. And a point that she did make was how amazing she felt she was treated with the funeral home and the funeral directors. She said they were incredibly empathetic. She knew none of them had been through a traumatic experience like that themselves before, but they could still hear her out and listen to her and be there for her. They were very patient with her, understanding that she was the one making all of these decisions because there were no pre-need things made. Dave passed away. It was tragic. She described it as an out of order death. She thought she would grow old with this man and die, together, or at least within a few years of one another. And he just had an untimely death. So she was super pleased with how, super pleased with how the funeral home that she did end up going with treated her and her family through this time of shock and grieving. Something that Melissa mentioned, which I could assume is probably pretty common, is how long it took her to actually go through the grieving process. She kind of just carried on with life after all of this because she knew she had responsibilities. She had to take care of her 2 sons. She had a job. She did take time off from work, but she never really let anything sink in with her until she and her boys had moved back up to Portland to be with her family. She had that familial support at that point, so she could focus more on herself, and it hit her, wow, this man, his soul is always going to be with me, his spirit's always going to be with me, but I'm never going to physically touch or see him again. And it really hit her. So she would cope using alcohol, she would cope using drugs, and something she mentioned was the lack of resources for grieving widows. She said she did find a few, so something I did learn from her, and obviously people die in all sorts of different ways, but it's not something I had considered, is that she had found a resource online called Soaring Spirits International, and they put on a camp for widowed individuals. It's a weekend where all of these widows come together, specifically for widowed females, and they tell their stories. She said it's funny because the icebreaker is, how did your husband die? And she laughed when she said that because it's funny in a sense because that's how you start your conversation, but you know that you all have that one huge thing in common. She said it was just a great eye-opening experience, but eye-opening for multiple things. She got to know all these other ladies and all their stories, but she also got to understand that there, like I said, really aren't a whole lot of resources out there for widowed individuals. So now we'll kind of get into why she created this website and wrote a book called Filled with Gold. So The book title is named after the Japanese art of kintsugi. Essentially, it's a piece of pottery is broken, and instead of throwing it out, we fix it by fusing it back together with silver or gold. So essentially, she used that as an analogy for how she was. She was broken through this tragedy, but then hope was kind of like her gold that fused her back together. And although she had been broken previously, she was only more beautiful when she was put back together. So this whole book is about her story and the resources that she found, but also wanted to create for other women moving forward. So her website, Filled with Gold, is about a self-care like monthly subscription. You can get it, and inside of the box she put self-care items, so candles and soaps, but also resources and books from widows who went through, similar situations with the loss of their loved one. Stuff that these widowed female leaders can help better other widows moving forward. She said something along the lines of, I want these boxes to be something for these women that I wish I had when I was going through that. And I thought that was really special. Let's see here. So, I don't think there was anything I disagreed with that she said real quick. To be completely honest, nothing really. It was all very just eye-opening and enlightening. So I want to kind of just end this like this. Although there are so many ways people can die, rare cases like Dave and Melissa's, they're rare. Melissa's story only helped prepare me even more for those challenging conversations I'll have as a funeral director. She taught me that life doesn't stop and wait for us. There is no set of instructions. Melissa's story really emphasized that fact and pushed others to understand as well. I think her story taught me an important lesson of being prepared for absolutely anything, because life can really blindside you. And I think going into being a funeral director, that's a really important thing to be able to understand and grasp, so that I can help people who go through those rare traumatic situations to the best of my ability. Thanks.